There are stories that history tries to forget, stories that don't fit neatly into the narrative we've been taught, stories that make us question what we know about the human body, about science, about the very nature of survival itself. This is one of those stories. In the sweltering heat of rural Georgia in 1878, a child was born who would challenge everything the medical establishment thought they understood about human biology. His name was Nathaniel Johnson, and what made him extraordinary would also make him a prisoner. The cotton fields of Georgia in the late 1870s were a place of unspeakable cruelty. The Civil War had ended just 13 years earlier, but for many Black Americans, freedom remained an illusion. Slavery had been replaced by sharecropping, convict leasing, and a system of oppression that kept formerly enslaved people bound to the same land, the same masters, the same terror. The Reconstruction era had promised equality and opportunity, but by 1878, those promises were already crumbling under the weight of white supremacist violence and Northern indifference. It was into this world that Nathaniel Johnson was born, in a small cabin behind the main house of the Whitmore Plantation, to a woman named Sarah Johnson who had spent her entire life in bondage. Sarah had been enslaved since birth, born in 1848 on the same plantation where she would spend her entire life. She had been just 17 when the Civil War ended, old enough to remember the brutal realities of slavery, but young enough to have hoped that freedom might bring real change. She worked in the big house, cooking, cleaning, tending to the family that owned her body if not her soul. She had learned to read in secret, taught by another enslaved woman who risked severe punishment to pass on that forbidden knowledge. She could write her name and read simple texts, skills that would later prove invaluable, but that she kept hidden from the Whitmore family. Before we continue with Nathaniel Johnson's shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's strengthen our community together. Thank you. And now back to the story. When the war ended and freedom supposedly came, Sarah stayed on the plantation. She had nowhere else to go, no family to return to, no resources to start a new life. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her father had been sold away when she was just a baby. She had siblings, but they had been scattered across the South, sold to different plantations, and she had no way of finding them, so she remained working for wages that barely kept her fed, living in the same cabin where she had lived as a slave. The Whitmores called it employment, called her a free woman, but the reality was barely different from what had come before. She was still dependent on them for everything, still subject to their authority, still living under the constant threat of violence. It was there, on a humid August night in 1878, that she gave birth to her son. The father was never named in any records, and Sarah never spoke of him publicly. In a time and place where Black women had little control over their own bodies, where sexual violence was commonplace and rarely acknowledged, the silence around Nathaniel's paternity spoke volumes. Sarah had carried the pregnancy alone, working in the fields until the day she went into labor, receiving no special consideration or care from her employers. From the very beginning, Nathaniel was different. The midwife who delivered him, an elderly woman named Ruth, who had brought dozens of babies into the world during slavery and after, noticed it immediately. The child didn't cry the way other babies cried. When she cleaned his airways, when she cut the cord, when she placed him in his mother's arms, he remained calm, almost eerily so. His eyes were open, alert, watching everything around him with an intensity that seemed impossible for a newborn. Ruth said a prayer over him that night, sensing something she couldn't quite name. She had delivered babies who came into the world screaming, fighting for breath, their little bodies struggling with the shock of life outside the womb. But Nathaniel was different. He was quiet, observant, present in a way that unsettled her. As Nathaniel grew, that strangeness only became more apparent. He was a healthy child, stronger than most, but it wasn't his physical strength that set him apart. It was what didn't affect him. In those days, childhood was a dangerous time. Diseases swept through communities without warning, claiming young lives with terrifying regularity. Contaminated water killed indiscriminately. Minor infections became death sentences. Accidents, malnutrition, exposure to the elements. All of these things made childhood a perilous journey that many didn't survive. Sarah had already lost 2 children to disease, one to whooping cough when he was 3, another to what was probably dysentery when she was just 18 months old. She lived in constant fear of losing Nathaniel too, but Nathaniel seemed immune to all of it. When other children came down with fevers, Nathaniel remained healthy. when illnesses swept through the sharecropper cabins, leaving families devastated. Nathaniel never even got a sniffle. Sarah was grateful, but also worried. She had been raised with the folk wisdom of the enslaved community, beliefs that mixed African traditions with Christianity and practical survival knowledge. In that worldview, a child who was too different, too unusual, might draw unwanted attention from both the spirit world and from white people who saw any deviation from the expected as either a threat or an opportunity for exploitation. The first major incident happened when Nathaniel was 8 years old. It was a spring that people would remember for years afterward, a season of relentless rain that turned fields into mud and made work nearly impossible. The Whitmore plantation, like many others, struggled with the weather. Crops were delayed, workers were idle, and tensions ran high. But the worst consequence of the rain was what it did to the water supply. There had been heavy rains for 3 weeks straight, unprecedented downpours that flooded the low-lying areas and overwhelmed drainage systems. The well that served the sharecropper cabins had become contaminated. No one knew exactly what had gotten into it, whether it was runoff from the fields where fertilizers and pesticides had been used, animal waste from the nearby barns, or something else entirely. What they did know was that it was deadly. The first person to get sick was a man named Thomas, a field worker who had drunk deeply from the well after a long day of trying to clear drainage ditches. He was violently ill within hours, racked with convulsions and fever. By the next morning, he was dead. His death was followed quickly by another, a man named Jacob, who had also drunk from the well, began showing the same symptoms. The plantation doctor was called, but there was little he could do. Jacob died within 36 hours of drinking the water. 3 children also became violently ill, though they survived barely after days of suffering. The plantation overseer ordered the well closed immediately and brought in water from town, carried in barrels on wagons. But the damage had already been done. What no one knew at the time was that young Nathaniel had also drunk from that well. He had been thirsty after playing in the fields, and he had stopped at the well and taken several long drinks before heading home. Sarah discovered it by accident that evening when Nathaniel mentioned that the water had tasted funny. She felt her blood run cold. She grabbed him, shook him, demanded to know exactly when he had drunk from the well and how much he had consumed. Nathaniel, confused by his mother's fear, said he had been thirsty, that he had drunk his fill, maybe 4 or 5 ladles of water. Sarah waited for the sickness to come. She knew what contaminated water did. She had seen it before, had watched people die from it. The symptoms usually appeared within hours: severe stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, convulsions. Death could come quickly, especially for children whose smaller bodies couldn't withstand the onslaught. She stayed up all night watching Nathaniel, expecting at any moment to see the first signs of illness. But nothing happened. Nathaniel slept peacefully. He woke the next morning hungry, asking for breakfast, showing no signs of distress whatsoever. Sarah was baffled, but tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he hadn't drunk as much as he thought. Perhaps the contamination wasn't evenly distributed in the well, and he had gotten lucky. Perhaps God had protected him. She didn't tell anyone about the incident, afraid that drawing attention to it might somehow jinx her son's good fortune. But the plantation doctor, Dr. Bartholomew Reed, heard about it anyway. One of the other workers had seen Nathaniel at the well and mentioned it to Dr. Reed when he came to examine the sick children. Dr. Reed was immediately curious. He came to Sarah's cabin and asked to examine Nathaniel. Sarah was reluctant, but Dr. Reed was insistent, and she had learned long ago that refusing white men rarely ended well for black people. Dr. Reed examined Nathaniel thoroughly. He checked the boy's pulse, which was steady and strong. He looked at his tongue, which was a healthy pink. He listened to his breathing, which was clear and unlabored. He pressed on Nathaniel's stomach, checking for any signs of tenderness or distress. There were none. Nathaniel appeared to be in perfect health. Dr. Reed asked him questions about what he had drunk and when, confirming Sarah's account. Then he took a sample of the contaminated water from the well, which was still available before it was completely drained. Dr. Reed later examined the water under a microscope and confirmed it contained dangerous bacteria, organisms that should have made anyone who drank the water violently ill. The concentration was high enough that even a small amount should have caused symptoms. Yet Nathaniel showed no signs of ever having been sick, not even a mild upset stomach. Dr. Reed noted this in his journal with careful precision. He recorded the date, the circumstances, Nathaniel's age, the amount of water consumed, and the complete absence of symptoms. He noted that 2 adult men had died from drinking this same water, that 3 children had nearly died, and that this boy had consumed a substantial amount and remained completely healthy. He wrote several theories about why this might have happened, but each one seemed unlikely. Perhaps the boy's portion of the water hadn't been as contaminated. Perhaps his stomach had been full of food that somehow neutralized the bacteria. Perhaps he had some natural resistance to this particular pathogen. But Dr. Reed ultimately dismissed the incident as an anomaly, a fortunate coincidence that didn't warrant further investigation. He had more pressing concerns, other patients to attend to, and one healthy child seemed less important than preventing further deaths from the contaminated well. He filed his notes away and moved on. 3 years later, that dismissal would seem premature. Nathaniel was 11 years old now, tall for his age and strong from years of working in the fields. By the time black children in the South reached this age, they were expected to work like adults to contribute their labor to the household economy. Childhood, such as it was, ended early for sharecropper families who needed every able body to survive. It was late summer, and the cotton was ready for harvest. The work was brutal, back-breaking labor under a merciless sun that beat down on the fields from dawn until dusk. Workers moved through the rows with large sacks slung over their shoulders, picking the cotton bolls and stuffing them into the sacks until they were full. The weight of a full sack could be 50 lb or more, a crushing burden that had to be dragged to the weighing station at the end of each row. Nathaniel was smaller than the adults, but he was expected to work just as hard to fill his sack, just as full. The Whitmores didn't make allowances for age or size. You were judged by how much cotton you picked, and if you didn't meet the quota, you didn't eat. Nathaniel didn't complain. He had learned early that complaints brought punishment, that the best way to survive was to keep your head down and do what you were told. He had seen other workers beaten for talking back, for working too slowly, for any infraction, real or imagined. The end of slavery had not ended the violence. It had just changed its legal status. He was working around near the edge of the field, close to where the cultivated land gave way to wild growth. This was always dangerous territory. The edges of the fields were where snakes liked to hide, where they could find shade and prey. Workers had been bitten before, some fatally, but the cotton didn't harvest itself, and every row had to be picked clean. Nathaniel reached for a cotton boll, his fingers working automatically after hours of repetitive motion when he felt a sudden sharp pain in his right hand. It was like being stabbed with 2 hot needles, a burning sensation that shot up his arm. He pulled back instinctively, jerking his hand away, and saw the snake. It was a timber rattlesnake, a large one, easily 4 feet long and thick around as a man's wrist. The snake was coiled among the cotton plants, its distinctive brown and tan pattern providing perfect camouflage. Its tail was rattling, that distinctive buzzing sound that served as both warning and threat. Its head was raised, mouth open, fangs visible. Blood was already dripping from 2 puncture wounds on Nathaniel's right hand between his thumb and forefinger. Nathaniel made a sharp sound, not quite a scream, but a gasp of pain and surprise. The other workers heard it and came running. They knew what that sound meant. They had all heard it before. When they saw the bite marks on Nathaniel's hand, their faces registered a mixture of horror and resignation. Rattlesnake bites were often fatal, especially for children. The venom caused massive tissue damage, destroyed blood cells, led to organ failure. Even if the victim survived, they often lost the limb, the tissue dying and turning black as the venom did its work. One of the men killed the snake with his hoe, bringing the blade down hard and severing the snake's head from its body. It was important to kill it, both to prevent it from biting anyone else and to confirm what species it was. Different snakes had different venoms, and knowing what kind of snake had delivered the bite could help the doctor determine treatment, limited as those options were. Another worker ran to get help, sprinting toward the main house to fetch Dr. Reed. The others made Nathaniel sit down in the shade, tried to keep him calm, tried to slow the spread of the venom through his body. They knew the conventional wisdom: keep the victim still, keep the bitten limb lower than the heart if possible, tried to slow the circulation that would carry the venom throughout the body. One of the older women began to pray, her voice rising in a rhythmic cadence that mixed African call and response patterns with Christian imagery. Sarah arrived within minutes, having heard that her son had been bitten. Her face was stricken with terror. She had already lost 2 children to disease. She couldn't bear to lose another, especially not like this, not to a snake bite in the cotton fields. She knelt beside Nathaniel, took his hand, gently, examined the wound. The puncture marks were clear. Two small holes that were already beginning to swell slightly. Blood oozed from them, darker than normal blood, mixed with the first traces of venom. But as they waited for Dr. Reed to arrive, something strange happened. Or rather, something strange didn't happen. Nathaniel wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming in pain. He wasn't writhing or convulsing. He was sitting calmly, looking at his hand with more curiosity than fear. He told his mother that it hurt, but the pain was mild, like he had scraped his hand on something sharp or been stung by a wasp, nothing like the agonizing pain that was supposed to accompany a rattlesnake bite. Sarah examined the wound more closely. She had seen snake bites before. She knew what they looked like, how the flesh around the wound turned purple and then black as the tissue died, how the swelling spread rapidly up the limb, how the pain made grown men scream and beg for death. This wasn't like that. The puncture wounds were there, clear evidence that the snake had bitten and that the fangs had penetrated the skin. But there was no massive swelling, no discoloration spreading from the wound, no signs of the catastrophic tissue damage that should already be occurring. Reed arrived. He was breathing hard from the rush to get there. He had brought his medical bag, limited as his tools were. There was no anti-venom available, not in rural Georgia in 1889. The best he could offer was supportive care, treating symptoms as they appeared, perhaps attempting to slow the spread of venom through the use of tuwakets, though that often did more harm than good. He knelt beside Nathaniel and prepared himself to see a child in extremism suffering the agonizing effects of rattlesnake envenomation. Instead, he found a boy who appeared relatively calm and comfortable. Dr. Reed examined the dead snake first, confirming that it was indeed a timber rattlesnake, a species known for its potent hematoxic venom. The venom of a timber rattlesnake destroyed red blood cells, damaged blood vessel walls, caused massive internal bleeding and tissue death. A bite from a snake this size should have delivered a substantial dose of venom, more than enough to kill a child. He turned his attention to Nathaniel's hand, looking for the telltale signs of envenomation. The puncture wounds were there, clearly visible, but that was all. There was minimal swelling, barely more than you might see from a bee sting. There was no discoloration. The tissue around the wound looked healthy, pink, normal. Dr. Telef, Reed pressed on the area around the bite, checking for the hardness and heat that indicated tissue damage. There was none. He checked Nathaniel's pulse, expecting it to be rapid and weak as the body went into shock. It was steady and strong. He looked at the boy's eyes, expecting to see signs of distress, perhaps the beginning of neurological symptoms. Nathaniel's eyes were clear and calm. Dr. Reed waited. He knew that sometimes the symptoms of snakebite took time to develop, that the venom needed to spread through the bloodstream before its full effects became apparent. He stayed with Nathaniel for 3 hours, monitoring him constantly, watching for any change, but nothing changed. The boy remained comfortable, complained only of mild pain, showed no signs of the systemic poisoning that should have been occurring. As evening fell and Nathaniel still showed no symptoms, Dr. Reed began to consider the possibility that something very unusual had happened. He examined the snake's head, confirming that the fangs were intact and appeared to have venom sacs attached. He had seen dry bites before, instances where a venomous snake bit defensively without injecting venom, but those were relatively rare, occurring in perhaps 10 to 20% of bites. And even then, there were usually some symptoms, some reaction to the mechanical trauma of the bite itself. This was different. This was a clear bite from a venomous snake that should have caused severe, potentially fatal envenomation. Yet, the victim, a small child, was showing almost no reaction at all. Dr. Reed had no explanation. He told Sarah to watch Nathaniel carefully overnight to come get him immediately if any symptoms developed. But he was already beginning to suspect that no symptoms would develop, that something about this boy's biology was protecting him from the venom in a way that Dr. Reed didn't understand. The next day, Nathaniel woke up feeling fine. The puncture wounds on his hand had scabbed over and were already beginning to heal. There was no swelling, no discoloration, no pain beyond a slight tenderness at the site of the bite. Within 3 days, the wounds had healed completely, leaving only 2 small scars as evidence that the bite had ever occurred. Dr. Reed documented the case extensively in his journal. He noted every detail he could remember: the size of the snake, the location of the bite, the complete absence of expected symptoms, the rapid healing, He wrote several pages trying to explain what had happened, proposing and then discarding various theories. Could the snake have been defective somehow, unable to produce venom? No, the venom sacs were clearly present. Could the bite have failed to penetrate deeply enough to inject venom? No. The puncture wounds were clear and appeared to be deep enough. Could the boy have some natural immunity to rattlesnake venom? That seemed impossible, as such immunity had never been documented in humans. Dr. Reed was at a loss. He was a competent physician trained in the medical knowledge of his time, but this case defied everything he understood about snake bites and venom. He considered writing to colleagues about the case, but decided against it. Who would believe him? A country doctor claiming that a Negro child had been bitten by a rattlesnake and suffered no ill effects. It sounded like fantasy, like the kind of exaggerated tale that might be told around a campfire, but that had no place in serious medical discussion. Word of the incident began to spread through the sharecropper community. People talked in low voices about Sarah's boy, the one who couldn't get sick, who couldn't be poisoned. Some saw it as a blessing from God, a sign that the child was protected by divine favor. Others whispered darker theories, talked about deals with the devil, about unnatural abilities that marked a person as something other than human. In the African American folk tradition of the South, there were stories of people with special gifts, root workers who could handle poison without harm, conjurers who had power over snakes and venoms. Perhaps young Nathaniel was one of these gifted individuals. Sarah tried to protect her son from the attention, tried to discourage the stories and speculation. She knew that being different, being seen as unusual, was dangerous for black people in the South. It drew attention, and attention from white people was rarely good. She told people that Nathaniel had just been lucky, that the snake probably hadn't injected much venom, that it was nothing special. But the stories persisted and spread. The Whitmore family, who owned the plantation, began to take notice. Robert Whitmore was a man in his early 50s, the son of the plantation's founder, who had inherited the property after his father's death. He was educated by the standards of his time and place, having attended college for 2 years before the Civil War interrupted his education. He fancied himself a man of science and culture, someone who kept up with the latest developments in medicine, agriculture, and natural philosophy. He subscribed to medical journals, maintained a small library, and corresponded with other educated men about topics of mutual interest. When Robert Whitmore heard about the incident with the snake, he was immediately intrigued. He had read about unusual medical cases in his journals, about people who displayed unexpected resistance to disease or poison. Most of these cases were poorly documented, often little more than anecdotes. But here, on his own plantation, was a documented case of a child surviving a rattlesnake bite that should have been fatal. Reed had witnessed it, had documented it, could vouch for its authenticity. Whitmore saw an opportunity not to help Nathaniel, not to understand his condition for humanitarian purposes, but to study him, to document what he immediately began calling an anomaly of the Negro race. This was a time when scientific racism was at its peak, when the medical and scientific establishments were actively working to prove that black people were biologically inferior to whites, that they were essentially a different species, closer to animals than to civilized humans. The post-Civil War era had created a crisis for white supremacist ideology. If black people were truly inferior, how had they survived slavery? How had they maintained families, developed skills, created culture? The answer, according to the pseudoscience of the time, was that black people had evolved different biological traits suited to their primitive state. They were supposedly more resistant to heat, more able to withstand physical labor, less sensitive to pain, less intelligent, but more physically resilient. Every perceived difference between black and white bodies was documented and theorized about, always with the goal of justifying slavery, justifying oppression, justifying the continued subjugation of an entire people. Nathaniel, with his apparent immunity to poison and venom, was perfect fodder for these racist theories. He could be presented as evidence of fundamental biological differences between the races, proof that black people were indeed distinct from whites in measurable scientific ways. The fact that his immunity might actually be advantageous didn't matter. The narrative would frame it as evidence of primitive resilience, the kind of trait that might be found in lower animals, but that was somehow beneath the refinement of civilized white people. Robert Whitmore approached Sarah Johnson with a proposition. He wanted to study her son, to run tests, to understand what made him different. He framed it as a scientific endeavor, that would bring recognition to the plantation and perhaps even payment for medical colleges that might be interested in such a rare case. He promised that Nathaniel wouldn't be harmed, that the tests would be carefully controlled and supervised by Dr. Reed. He even offered to pay Sarah a small amount of money for her cooperation, more money than she typically earned in a month. Sarah didn't trust him. She didn't want her son subjected to experimentation, didn't want him turned into an object of study for white men's amusement, but she also knew she had no real choice. Whitmore owned the land they lived on, controlled their access to food and shelter, held all the power in their relationship. If she refused, he could throw them off the plantation, leave them with nowhere to go and no means of survival. Or worse, he might take Nathaniel anyway, claiming some legal authority over the child of a sharecropper who lived on his property. So she agreed, but with conditions. She insisted on being present for any tests. She demanded that nothing be done that would cause Nathaniel serious pain or lasting harm. She wanted assurances that the testing would be limited in scope and duration. Whitmore agreed to her terms, though both of them knew that his promises were only as good as his word, and his word was backed by the power of white supremacy, not by any legally enforceable contract. The experiments began in the fall of 1889, when Nathaniel was 11 years old. Dr. Reed, working under Whitmore's direction and with his enthusiastic participation, started with simple tests. They wanted to establish a baseline to understand the scope of Nathaniel's resistance to toxins and poisons. They began with substances that caused illness in most people, but that were not immediately life-threatening in small doses. The first test involved giving Nathaniel food that had been deliberately spoiled, allowed to rot to the point where it should have caused severe stomach upset. Dr. Reed prepared a small portion of spoiled meat that had been left out in the Georgia heat for several days until it was clearly putrid. The smell alone was enough to turn stomachs. He gave it to Nathaniel and instructed him to eat it. Sarah protested, but Whitmore reminded her of their agreement. Nathaniel, trying to be brave, ate the spoiled meat. Within hours, a normal person would have been violently ill, vomiting and suffering from severe intestinal distress. Nathaniel reported that the meat tasted bad and made him feel slightly nauseous, but he never vomited, never developed diarrhea, never showed any significant symptoms of food poisoning. By the next morning, he felt completely normal. They moved on to testing water deliberately contaminated with bacteria. Dr. Reed collected water from a stagnant pond known to be unsafe for drinking, water that contained visible algae and likely numerous harmful microorganisms. He had Nathaniel drink a full cup of this water while he carefully monitored the boy's vital signs. Again, Nathaniel showed no symptoms, no fever, no stomach cramps, no signs of infection. Emboldened by these results, they moved on to more dangerous substances. They obtained arsenic, a common poison used for rat control, and secretly used for more nefarious purposes in an era when poisoning was a common method of murder. Arsenic was particularly insidious because small doses could be mixed into food without being easily detected, and cumulative doses over time could cause a lingering death that might be mistaken for natural illness. Dr. Reed started with a dose of arsenic that was small enough that it shouldn't kill, but that should definitely have caused symptoms. He mixed it into Nathaniel's food and watched carefully. Nathaniel ate the food and reported that it tasted slightly bitter and metallic, but he showed no other reaction. No vomiting, no abdominal pain, no convulsions. They waited 24 hours monitoring him constantly. Nothing happened. They increased the dose, now giving Nathaniel an amount of arsenic that would have killed a grown man if administered all at once. They spread it across several meals, mixing it into his food over the course of a day. Nathaniel continued to eat normally, continued to function normally, showed no signs of arsenic poisoning. His skin didn't develop the characteristic darkening that often occurred with arsenic exposure. His hair didn't fall out. He didn't experience the neurological symptoms, the weakness, the paralysis that arsenic typically caused. Dr. Reed was astonished. He documented everything meticulously, noting dosages, times of administration, observed symptoms or lack thereof. He drew some of Nathaniel's blood and examined it under a microscope, looking for any abnormalities. The blood appeared normal, the cells healthy and properly formed. He tested Nathaniel's urine, expecting to find evidence of arsenic being filtered through the kidneys. He found only trace amounts, far less than he expected given the doses that had been administered. It was as if Nathaniel's body was processing the arsenic so efficiently that it was being eliminated before it could cause any damage, but this shouldn't have been possible. Arsenic worked by interfering with cellular metabolism, disrupting the production of energy at the cellular level. Even if Nathaniel's kidneys and liver were extraordinarily efficient at filtering it out, he should have shown some symptoms during the time the arsenic was in his system. They tested other poisons, mercury, which they obtained from broken thermometers and old medical compounds, lead, which was readily available in paint and in the form of lead shot used for hunting, various plant-based toxins extracted from oleander, gyson weed, and other poisonous plants that grew wild in Georgia. Each time Nathaniel showed minimal reaction or no reaction at all. He might report that something tasted bad or made him feel slightly uncomfortable, but he never became seriously ill, never showed the symptoms that should have accompanied exposure to these deadly substances. The testing continued for months, becoming more elaborate and more dangerous. Whitmore invited colleagues to observe men who shared his interest in documenting what they saw as evidence of racial difference. Nathaniel was measured, weighed, examined. His reflexes were tested. His cognitive abilities were assessed. Everything about him was documented and theorized about. Robert Whitmore began to develop his interpretation of Nathaniel's immunity. He wrote papers for local medical societies, suggesting that Nathaniel represented proof of fundamental biological differences between the races. He theorized that black people, whom he referred to using the terminology of scientific racism prevalent at the time, had evolved different biological mechanisms to survive in what he called harsh, primitive environments. He suggested that their bodies were more primitive, but also more resilient in certain ways, that they had sacrificed higher cognitive functions for increased physical durability. His theories were scientifically baseless, built on racist assumptions rather than genuine observation, but they were eagerly embraced by others who were looking for scientific justification for white supremacy and black oppression. Nathaniel became a case study, his name appearing in papers and presentations as evidence of Negro biological distinctiveness. The fact that his immunity was objectively advantageous was reframed as evidence of primitive resilience, the kind of trait you might find in lower animals. But that was somehow beneath the refinement of civilized humanity. Nathaniel himself had no say in any of this. He was 13 years old now, and his life had become an endless series of tests and examinations. He was given substances to eat and drink, things that tasted terrible, things that made him feel sick, even if they didn't cause serious symptoms. He was poked with needles to draw blood. He was exposed to plants known to cause severe skin reactions, then observed to see if he developed rashes or burns. He was bitten by insects whose venom caused painful swelling in other people, then examined to see how his body responded. Through it all, he remained remarkably healthy. The toxic plants that gave other people terrible rashes caused only minor redness on his skin that faded within hours. The insect bites that made others swell up and ache caused him only momentary discomfort. The poisons that should have killed him or made him violently ill passed through his system with minimal effect. He hated every minute of it. He hated being treated like an animal or an object rather than a person. He hated the way the white men talked about him when they thought he couldn't understand their medical terminology. He hated seeing his mother's face every time they administered another poison, her fear and helplessness visible even as she tried to stay strong for him. But he endured it because his mother asked him to, because they needed the small amount of money Whitmore paid them, because he had been taught from birth that black people had no choice but to submit to white authority. As word of the experiment spread beyond the local area, more people became interested in Nathaniel's case. A professor from the Medical College of South Carolina traveled to the plantation to observe Nathaniel and review Dr. Reed's documentation. This professor, whose name was recorded as Dr. Tenpeda, Edmund Carlisle, was particularly interested in what he called tropical medicine, though his real focus was on documenting supposed biological differences between races. Dr. Carroll was impressed by what he observed. He watched as Nathaniel consumed substances that should have made him ill and showed no reaction. He reviewed Dr. Temple, Reed's careful notes, the documentation of doses administered, and symptoms observed. He examined Nathaniel physically, measuring the boy's head circumference, the length of his limbs, the proportion of his features, all standard practices in the racist pseudoscience of anthropometry that sought to prove racial hierarchies through body measurements. Dr. Carroll wanted to take the research further. He proposed more invasive tests, including surgical procedures that would allow them to examine Nathaniel's organs directly to see if there were physical differences in his liver, kidneys, or digestive system that might explain his immunity. He suggested taking tissue samples from multiple organs, procedures that would require cutting into the boy's body. Sarah absolutely refused. She had agreed to let them test Nathaniel with various substances, but she would not allow them to cut him open to take pieces of his organs for examination. Dr. Carryle argued that such procedures were essential for advancing medical knowledge, that they could be done safely with proper anesthesia, that the risk to Nathaniel was minimal compared to the potential scientific value. Sarah didn't care about scientific value. Her son was not going to be vivisected for the curiosity of white scientists. The refusal created tension. Dr. Carroll and even Dr. Carroll, Reed, who had developed something resembling sympathy for Nathaniel over the months of testing, tried to persuade Sarah to change her mind. They offered more money. They promised that Nathaniel would be given the best medical care available during and after the procedures. They even suggested that the knowledge gained might someday help other people, might lead to treatments for poisoning that could save lives. But Sarah stood firm, and Whitmore, despite his interest in the case, was unwilling to force the issue. Partly, this was because he knew that such invasive procedures carried real risks, and if Nathaniel died during one of them, Whitmore would lose his valuable research subject. Partly it was because he recognized that there were limits to what even white supremacist society would tolerate in forcibly performing surgery on a child over his mother's objections might cross a line that would bring unwanted scrutiny. Dr. Carl eventually left disappointed, but also excited by what he had observed. He wrote several papers about Nathaniel's case, though he never mentioned the boy by name. He described a Negro youth with extraordinary resistance to multiple forms of poison and venom, a case that he presented as evidence of fundamental biological differences between races. His papers were published in regional medical journals and cited by other advocates of scientific racism. Meanwhile, a different kind of attention was being drawn to Nathaniel, a traveling preacher, a man who made his living moving from town to town, delivering fiery sermons and selling religious pamphlets, heard about the boy who couldn't be poisoned. This preacher, who called himself Reverend Hosea Black, saw Nathaniel not as a scientific curiosity, but as a spiritual threat. Reverend Black arrived at the plantation unannounced one Sunday afternoon when many of the sharecrows were gathered for their own religious services in a small church they had built themselves. He interrupted the service, pushing his way to the front and demanding attention. He was a large man, powerfully built, with a booming voice that could fill a room without effort. He began to preach about demons and possession, about how Satan could give people unholy powers to deceive the faithful. He declared that he had heard about a boy on this very plantation who could drink poison and live, who had been bitten by serpents and survived. He said that such abilities were not gifts from God, but signs of demonic possession, that the boy was being used by Satan to lead people astray, to make them doubt God's natural order. He worked the crowd into a state of religious fervor, getting them to shout and call out, demanding that the demon child be brought forward. Some people in the congregation knew he was talking about Nathaniel and looked uncomfortable. They knew the boy had watched him grow up, had seen his mother's devotion and care. He didn't seem possessed. He seemed like a normal child who happened to have an unusual gift. But others, caught up in the preacher's rhetoric, began to wonder, was it natural for a child to survive things that killed adults? Was it godly? Reverend Black demanded that Nathaniel be brought to him so that he could perform an exorcism, drive out the demons that had given the boy his unholy powers. When Sarah heard what was happening, she grabbed Nathaniel and tried to leave, tried to get him away from the church and away from the preacher. But Reverend Black saw them leaving and followed, his supporters trailing behind him. He caught up with them outside the church, grabbing Sarah's arm and demanding that she hand over the boy. Sarah pulled away, putting herself between Nathaniel and the preacher. She told him to leave them alone, that her son was not possessed, that he was a child of God, just like everyone else. Reverend Black insisted that he was doing God's work, that he was trying to save the boy's immortal soul from damnation. The confrontation escalated. Reverend Black tried to force his way past Sarah to get to Nathaniel. He pulled out a flask of what he claimed was holy water, blessed by a priest in Charleston, which he said would drive out demons when forced down the throat of the possessed. Sarah fought him, pushing him away, screaming for help. Other people from the church came running, some to support the preacher, others to defend Sarah and Nathaniel. In the chaos, Reverend Black managed to grab Nathaniel and force the flask to the boy's lips, trying to pour the liquid down his throat. Nathaniel, terrified and angry, fought back. He twisted in the preacher's grip, kicked at his legs, and when the preacher's hand came near his face, Nathaniel bit down hard on the man's hand, breaking the skin and drawing blood. Reverend Black jerked his hand away with a howl of pain and rage. He held up his bleeding hand for everyone to see. shouting that the boy had proven himself to be demonic, that his violent resistance confirmed the presence of evil spirits. The demon inside the child had lashed out, he proclaimed, had attacked a man of God who was only trying to save his soul. Some people in the crowd believed him. Others thought he had gone too far, that he was terrorizing an innocent child. Robert Whitmore, attracted by the commotion, arrived to find a chaotic scene outside the church. His sharecroppers were divided, arguing among themselves, some supporting the preacher and some defending Nathaniel. Whitmore was not a particularly religious man and had little patience for what he saw as superstitious nonsense. More importantly, Reverend Black was disrupting his property and threatening his research subject. Whitmore stepped into the middle of the crowd and ordered everyone to be quiet. He told Reverend Black that Nathaniel was under his protection, that the boy was the subject of important scientific research, and that any further attempts at exorcism would result in the preacher being forcibly removed from the plantation. He made it clear that he had the legal authority to have Reverend Black arrested for trespassing and assault if he didn't leave immediately. Reverend Black, faced with the reality of white legal power, backed down. But he didn't leave quietly. He proclaimed loudly that the entire plantation was cursed, that God's judgment would fall upon all who sheltered the demon child, that disease and disaster would strike them down for their wickedness. He warned the sharecroppers that they were in danger, that living alongside such evil would bring destruction upon them all. Then he left, still shouting warnings and prophecies as he departed. The incident left Nathaniel badly shaken. He had been frightened by the preacher's violence, confused by the accusations of demonic possession. He asked his mother if he really was possessed, if there was something evil inside him that made him different. Sarah held him and told him that he was not possessed, that he was her son and God's child, that his gift was just that, a gift, not a curse. But she could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that maybe the preacher was right. For Sarah, the incident was a turning point. She realized that her son would never be safe as long as he remained on the Whitmore plantation. The scientific experiments were bad enough, degrading and exploitative, but at least they didn't threaten Nathaniel's sense of self. But now, religious fanatics were calling him demonic, and she knew from bitter experience that such accusations could lead to violence, even to murder. Black people accused of witchcraft or possession had been killed by mobs before. It could happen to Nathaniel. She began to plan their escape more seriously. She started setting aside small amounts of food, hiding them in their cabin. She collected spare clothing, a blanket, anything that might be useful for traveling. She talked quietly to other sharecroppers she trusted, asking about routes north, about safe places to stop, about who might help them. She was careful not to reveal too much, not to give anyone enough information that they could betray her plans to Whitmore. But she gathered what intelligence she could. The situation became even more urgent when Whitmore received the letter from New Orleans. The letter came from a man who identified himself as a collector of curiosities and promoter of exhibitions. He had heard about Nathaniel through the medical papers that Dr. Carlyle had published, had learned about the boy who couldn't be poisoned, and he saw an opportunity for profit. The letter outlined a business proposition. The man wanted to purchase Nathaniel outright to take possession of the boy and exhibit him in traveling shows across the South and potentially beyond. He described how such exhibitions worked. Nathaniel would be displayed in theaters and halls with demonstrations of his immunity performed for paying audiences. They would have him drink visibly contaminated water, consume small amounts of poison, handle venomous creatures, all while spectators watched and marveled. The letter suggested that such a show could be enormously profitable with people willing to pay significant sums to witness such an impossible spectacle. The offer included a specific price, a sum of money that was substantial by the standards of the time, certainly more than Whitmore could hope to earn from Nathaniel's labor in the fields, or even from allowing occasional scientific observers to study him. The letter writer suggested that Whitmore could even retain a percentage of the exhibition profits, turning Nathaniel into a source of ongoing revenue. Whitmore was genuinely tempted. The plantation was struggling financially, as many southern plantations were in the post-war economy. Cotton prices were depressed. Labor costs had risen with the end of slavery, and competition from other agricultural regions was increasing. The money being offered for Nathaniel was enough to solve many immediate financial problems and provide a cushion against future difficulties. He discussed the offer with Dr. Reed. The doctor's reaction was complicated. On one hand, he recognized that selling a child to be exhibited like a circus freak was morally questionable at best. On the other hand, he was fascinated by Nathaniel's case and saw value in having the boy available for continued study, which might be easier if he were in the hands of someone who traveled and could make him available to medical professionals in different cities. Dr. Reed suggested a compromise. Perhaps instead of selling Nathaniel outright, they could arrange for him to be studied at a medical college where he could receive care and education while also being available for scientific investigation. Whitmore was less enthusiastic about this idea, as it would bring less immediate financial benefit, but he agreed to consider it. Sarah discovered the offer completely by accident. She was cleaning the main house, as she did several times a week, when she overheard Whitmore and Dr. Reed discussing it in the study. She was supposed to be working in a different part of the house, but she had come back to retrieve a cleaning rag she had forgotten. She froze outside the study door when she heard them mention Nathaniel's name. She listened in growing horror as they discussed the possibilities: selling him to the exhibition promoter, sending him to a medical college, treating him like property to be disposed of for profit or convenience. They talked about her son as if he were an object, a thing with no consideration for what he might want or how such actions might affect him. They talked about what was best for science, what was best for the plantation's finances, but never once mentioned what might be best for Nathaniel himself. Sarah managed to slip away without being discovered, but her hands were shaking and her mind was racing. That night, after Nathaniel had gone to sleep, she sat in their cabin and made a decision. They had to leave. They had to run. It didn't matter that they had nowhere to go, no resources, no clear plan. Staying meant losing her son, either to an exhibition where he would be displayed like an animal, or to a medical college where he would be experimented on more extensively than ever before, or to a mob of religious fanatics who thought he was possessed. Any of those fates was unacceptable. She woke Nathaniel and told him they needed to talk. She explained everything she had overheard, told him about the offer from New Orleans, about the plans to sell him or send him away. She saw the fear and hurt in his eyes, saw him struggling to understand why people wanted to treat him this way. She told him that they were going to leave, that they would go to Tennessee, where her sister Martha lived, that they would find safety somehow. Nathaniel listened, and then he said something that surprised her. He told her that he had been thinking about his ability, about what it meant, about how it might be used. He said that during all the experiments, during all the testing, he had learned things about poisons and how they work. He had learned which plants were toxic, which substances were dangerous, how to recognize contamination. And he had been thinking that maybe his immunity wasn't just something that made him a target for exploitation. Maybe it could be used to help people. He reminded her of the contaminated well from years ago, the one that had killed 2 men. He said that if he had known then what he knew now, if he had tested that water before anyone else drank it, those men might still be alive. He told her about overhearing conversations among the sharecrowers, stories of other communities where people had died from poisoned wells, where vigilantes had deliberately contaminated water supplies to terrorize black families. He said that, with his immunity, he could test water before anyone else drank it, could detect poison and warn people, could save lives. Sarah was afraid. She wanted her son to be safe, to live a quiet life, to avoid the attention and danger that his abilities brought. But she also recognized the determination in his eyes, the sense of purpose that was growing in him. She realized that he was no longer just a child to be protected. He was becoming a young man with his own ideas about how his life should be lived, about how his gifts should be used. They talked late into the night, planning. Sarah still wanted to leave the plantation to get away from Whitmore and the threat of being sold or sent away, but Nathaniel wanted to use their journey to help people to stop in communities along the way and offer his services. Sarah finally agreed to a compromise. They would leave the plantation and head for Tennessee, but they would take their time, would stop in communities that needed help, would let Nathaniel use his gift to protect people, but they would be careful, would avoid drawing too much attention, would keep moving before anyone could try to capture or exploit him again. They began their preparations in earnest. Sarah continued to set aside food and supplies. Nathaniel, meanwhile, spent time with Silas, the older sharecropper who knew about herbs and plants. Silas had noticed Nathaniel's interest in botany and had been teaching him informally, sharing knowledge that had been passed down to generations of enslaved people who had learned to use plants for medicine, for food, for survival. Now Nathaniel asked more pointed questions. He wanted to know which plants were poisonous and how to identify them. He wanted to know what symptoms different poisons caused, how quickly they acted, how they could be detected. Silas, who had lived through slavery and understood the importance of such knowledge in a world where poison was sometimes used as a weapon against black people, shared everything he knew. Silas taught him about oleander, beautiful but deadly, every part of it toxic enough to kill. He taught him about Jim's weed, which caused hallucinations and delirium before death. He showed him water hemlock, which grew near streams and could be mistaken for edible plants, its roots containing a poison so potent that a single bite could kill. He explained pokey, white snake root, and dozens of other plants that dotted the southern landscape, each with its own particular danger. More importantly, Silas taught Nathaniel how to think like someone protecting a community from poison. He explained that poisoners often used arsenic because it was readily available and hard to detect. That contaminated wells were a favorite target because they affected entire communities. That small amounts of poison added to food over time were harder to trace than a single large dose. He taught Nathaniel to think not just about identifying poisons, but about anticipating how they might be used. Their escape was planned for October during the new moon, when the nights would be darkest and their absence might not be noticed immediately. Sarah chose a Sunday night, knowing that Monday was a lighter workday and that the Whiters often slept late after church. They would leave after midnight, taking only what they could carry, heading north on foot. But before they could execute their plan, something happened that would change everything and set Nathaniel on the path that would define the rest of his life. A group of white vigilantes, men who called themselves night riders and who terrorized black communities in the name of white supremacy, struck a settlement about 5 miles from the Whitmore plantation. The night riders were a constant threat in the post-Reconstruction South. They were the successors to the wartime Confederate guerrillas and the predecessors to the Ku Klux Klan in its various incarnations. They operated with impunity, protected by sympathetic law enforcement and a legal system that refused to hold white men accountable for violence against black people. They rode at night, their faces sometimes covered, burning cabins, beating people, murdering those who dared to assert their rights, or who simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of their favorite tactics was poisoning wells. It was simple, effective, and hard to trace. They would find a well used by a black community, dump poison into it, and ride away. Within hours or days, people would start getting sick. Children would die first, their smaller bodies unable to withstand the poison. Then the elderly, the sick, the weak. By the time anyone realized the water was contaminated, multiple people might be dead or dying. The settlement they hit was called Hope's Creek, named for the small stream that ran through it. It was home to about 30 black families, mostly sharecrows and laborers, who had pulled their resources to buy a small parcel of land where they could build homes and try to create some measure of independence. They had dug a communal well deep and reliable that served the entire community. The night riders came on a Saturday night when most people were home and asleep. They rode in quietly, located the well, and dumped a large quantity of arsenic into it. They had brought it in quantity, enough to ensure that the contamination would be severe and widespread. Then they rode away, leaving no trace beyond hoof prints that would be obscured by the next day's traffic. Sunday morning, people drew water from the well for cooking breakfast, for making coffee, for washing. The water looked normal, smelled normal. There was perhaps a faint metallic taste, but nothing obvious enough to raise alarm. By Sunday afternoon, people began to get sick. It started with nausea and vomiting, then progressed to severe abdominal pain and bloody diarrhea. By Sunday evening, 3 people were dead. An elderly man, a young woman, and a 4-year-old child. More deaths followed overnight. An infant who had been given water mixed with milk. A teenage boy who had drunk deeply from the well after working in the garden. A pregnant woman who had used the water to make tea. By Monday morning, 7 people were dead, and at least 15 more were severely ill. The community was in crisis, terrified and confused, not knowing what had happened or how to stop it. Word spread quickly through the network of sharecropper communities. Messengers carried the news from settlement to settlement, warning people, asking for help. The news reached the Whitmore plantation by Monday afternoon, brought by a man who had walked from Hope's Creek specifically to spread the warning. The man told anyone who would listen about the poisoned well, about the deaths, about the suffering. He said they had stopped using the well as soon as they realized it was making people sick. But the damage was already done. They had sent for a doctor from town, but the doctor had little to offer beyond sympathy. There was no treatment for arsenic poisoning beyond supportive care, keeping the victims hydrated and comfortable while their bodies tried to process the toxin. For many, it was too late. Nathaniel heard this news from the other sharecroppers who were talking about it in hushed, frightened voices. The description of the symptoms, the rapid progression from health to death, the fact that it was the water that was poisoned. All of this resonated with what he had learned from the experiments. He recognized it as arsenic poisoning, the same poison he had been given during the tests, the poison his body had processed without harm. He felt something shift inside him, a clarity of purpose that he had never experienced before. These were people like him, like his mother, people who were just trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. They had been murdered with poison, the very thing his body could detect and process. And he suddenly knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. He found his mother and told her he wanted to go to Hope's Creek to test their water to see if he could help. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse to keep him safe, to not let him put himself in danger. But she saw the determination in his face, saw that he had made up his mind, and she remembered what he had said about wanting to use his gift to help people. This was exactly the kind of situation he had been talking about. She told him that if he was going, she was going with him. They would tell Whitmore they were visiting relatives, which was vaguely true since they were planning to head in the direction of Tennessee anyway. They packed a small bag with supplies and left early Tuesday morning. The walk to Hope's Creek took about 2 hours. As they approached the settlement, they could see that something was terribly wrong. There were people gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. Several cabins had black cloth hung outside, the traditional sign of death. The atmosphere was one of grief and fear, a community that had been struck by disaster and didn't know how to respond. Nathaniel and Sarah made their way to what appeared to be the central gathering area where an older woman was organizing efforts to care for the sick and prepare the dead for burial. Sarah approached her and asked if there was anything they could do to help. The woman, whose name was Ada, looked at them with tired, grieving eyes and said that unless they could bring back the dead or make the water safe again, there wasn't much anyone could do. That's when Nathaniel spoke up. He said that he might be able to help with the water, that he had a gift that let him detect poison, that he could test the well and tell them exactly what was wrong with it. Ada looked at him skeptically. He was just a boy, barely into his teens. How could he possibly know anything about poison? Sarah explained as simply as she could about Nathaniel's immunity, about the contaminated water he had drunk as a child, about the snake bite, about the experiments. She told Ada that her son had been tested with poisons and had shown a remarkable ability to resist them, that he could consume things that would kill other people and suffer no harm. She said that he had learned to recognize different types of poison and that he might be able to identify what had contaminated the well. Ada was skeptical, but also desperate. She had lost her granddaughter to the poisoned water, a bright 7-year-old girl who had been healthy and happy on Saturday and dead by Monday. If there was any chance that this boy could help prevent more deaths, she was willing to try. She took Nathaniel and Sarah to the well. The well stood in the center of the settlement, a simple structure with a wooden frame and a rope and bucket system. A sign had been posted warning people not to drink the water, and buckets of safe water brought from the creek were sitting nearby. Nathaniel approached the well and lowered the bucket, drawing up a sample of water. The water looked clear, just as contaminated water often did. Arsenic dissolved readily in water and left no visible trace. Nathaniel lifted the bucket and poured some water into a cup. He lifted it to his nose first, sniffing carefully. There was a faint metallic scent, subtle enough that most people would miss it. Then he tasted it. Just a small sip at first, rolling it around in his mouth before swallowing. He recognized the taste immediately. It was the same bitter metallic flavor he had tasted during the experiments when Dr. Reed had given him arsenic. He took another small sip to confirm, and yes, there was no doubt the well had been poisoned with arsenic, and from the strength of the taste, a significant amount had been added. He told Ada and the others who had gathered what he had found. He explained that the well had been deliberately poisoned with arsenic, that someone had dumped a large quantity into it, that the water was definitely not safe to drink. He also told them that the arsenic would settle at the bottom of the well over time, being heavier than water, but that drawing water would stir it up and bring it back into suspension. The well would need to be completely emptied and cleaned before it could be used again. The people of Hope's Creek were grateful for the information, but they also had questions. How had this boy been able to identify the poison just by tasting it? Why hadn't it made him sick like it had made everyone else sick? Nathaniel tried to explain his immunity as simply as he could, telling them about his experiences, about how his body seemed able to process poisons that affected other people. Some people were amazed, others were frightened, wondering if the boy might be unnatural in some way, but most were simply grateful that someone had finally been able to tell them definitively what had happened and how to begin to make things right. They began the process of emptying the well bucket by bucket, disposing of the contaminated water far from any place where people or animals might access it. As Nathaniel and Sarah prepared to leave Hope's Creek, Ada thanked them and asked if they might be willing to help other communities. She said she had heard of other suspicious deaths, other wells that might have been poisoned, other communities that needed someone who could test their water and tell them if it was safe. She said that what Nathaniel had done for Hope's Creek could save many more lives if he was willing to travel and offer his services. Nathaniel looked at his mother, and Sarah looked back at him. They both knew that this was the moment of decision. They could continue on to Tennessee, disappear into anonymity, live quiet lives, and hope that Whitmore never found them. Or they could do what Ada was suggesting, use Nathaniel's gift to help communities that had no other protection against poisoning. Sarah thought about the 7 people who had died at Hope's Creek, thought about how many more might have died if they hadn't figured out the water was poisoned, thought about other communities where the same thing might be happening. She thought about her son's gift, this strange immunity that had made him a target for exploitation, but that could also be used to save lives. And she made her choice. She told Ada that they would help, that they would travel to communities that needed their services, that Nathaniel would test water and food and warn people about contamination. But she also said that they would need to be careful, that they couldn't stay in any one place for too long, that there were people who might try to exploit or harm Nathaniel if they knew about his abilities. Ada understood. She promised to be discreet, to spread the word to trusted networks to help Nathaniel and Sarah stay safe while they did their work. She gave them the names of people in other communities who could be trusted, who would help them, who would protect them. And so began the journey that would define the rest of Nathaniel Johnson's life. He and his mother left Hope's Creek and began traveling through Georgia, stopping in black communities, testing water supplies, identifying contamination, saving lives. Word spread through the network of sharecropper settlements and free black communities passed along by trusted messengers in quiet conversations. The boy who could not be poisoned was traveling the South using his gift to protect people from one of the weapons being used against them. They called him different names in different places: the poison tester, the boy who couldn't die, the one who could taste death and live. The stories grew and changed with each telling, becoming more elaborate, more fantastic, but at their core, they were true. Nathaniel Johnson really could detect poisons, really could consume substances that would kill others, really was using his ability to save lives. The journey that should have taken 2 weeks to reach Tennessee took 3 months because they stopped so often to help communities in need. They tested wells in small settlements across Georgia. They examined food supplies that people suspected had been tampered with. They identified toxic plants that had been deliberately placed near water sources. Nathaniel's reputation grew with each community they helped. Sarah documented their work carefully, keeping a journal in her careful handwriting. She recorded the places they visited, the poisons they found, the lives they saved. She knew that this record might someday be important, might serve as testimony to what her son had done, might prove that his gift had been used for good rather than just being something that made him a target for exploitation. They finally reached Martha's home in Tennessee in late January of 1892, exhausted but also fulfilled in a way neither of them had expected. Martha, Sarah's sister, welcomed them with open arms. She had escaped to freedom during the war and had built a life in a community called Freedom Hill, a settlement of formerly enslaved people who had pulled their resources to buy land and create a new life for themselves. It was a place of hope and mutual support where people helped each other, protected each other, tried to create something better than what they had known under slavery. Martha gave Sarah and Nathaniel a place to stay, helped them settle in, listened to their stories of the journey and the work they had been doing. But Nathaniel couldn't rest for long. Word of his abilities had preceded him to Tennessee, carried by travelers and letters, and communities there had the same problems as communities in Georgia: poisoned wells, contaminated food, mysterious deaths that no one could explain. Nathaniel felt compelled to help to continue using his gift to protect people. It was in Tennessee that he met the others, the people who would become his companions in the work. Clarawara was the first. She was a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, who had survived smallpox 3 times. Each time she had made a full recovery with minimal scarring. In an era when smallpox killed millions, when survivors were often left disfigured and disabled, Clarawara's repeated survival was remarkable. She had come to understand that her immunity meant she could help during outbreaks, that she could tend to the sick without fear of infection. She had been working as a nurse of sorts, moving from community to community during smallpox outbreaks, caring for victims when everyone else fled. She and Nathaniel met at a quarantine site where she was nursing patients, and he had come to test the water supply to ensure it wasn't contributing to the outbreak. They recognized something in each other immediately, an understanding of what it meant to be different, to have a body that didn't respond the way other bodies did. They understood the burden and the gift of their unusual abilities, the way people looked at them with mixtures of wonder and fear, the responsibility that came with being able to help in ways others couldn't. They began working together. Clara would tend to disease victims, providing care and comfort, while Nathaniel ensured that food and water supplies were safe, that contamination wasn't compounding the health crisis. Together, they saved lives, dozens of them working in communities that had been abandoned or neglected by traditional medicine. Joshua joined them next. He had been born blind, his eyes damaged at birth in ways that the medicine of the time couldn't repair or explain, but he had developed extraordinary senses of hearing and smell to compensate. He could hear things that others missed, the subtle sounds of flowing water, the difference between clean water and contaminated water based on how it moved and splashed. He could smell poisons that had no obvious odor to others, detecting them through minute changes in the air, through chemical traces that his highly developed olfactory sense could pick up. He had been wandering from place to place, warning people about contaminated water sources, but often arriving too late to prevent illness. When he met Nathaniel, Clara, and Sarah, he found a purpose and a family. Together, they could identify contamination quickly before anyone got sick. Joshua would use his extraordinary senses to locate suspicious water sources. Nathaniel would test them directly. Clara would tend to anyone who had already been exposed, and Sarah would coordinate their efforts and keep records of their work. Rebecca was the last to join them. She was an older woman, perhaps in her 40s, who had spent most of her life as a cook in wealthy white households. She had learned to recognize when food had been tampered with, could see the subtle changes in color and texture and consistency that indicated poison or spoilage. She had saved her employers from several poisoning attempts by jealous rivals or disgruntled servants, though they had never acknowledged her role in their survival. When she heard about Nathaniel, Clara, and Joshua, she left her position and sought them out. She was tired of protecting people who didn't value her, who saw her as property or as a servant rather than as a person with remarkable skills. She wanted to help her own people, to use her abilities to save those who actually needed saving, who would appreciate what she could do. Together, the four of them, along with Sarah, who served as their organizer and record keeper, became something unprecedented in the post-Civil War South. They traveled through Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, going wherever they were needed, testing water and food, identifying contamination, tending to the sick, saving lives. They developed a sophisticated system of working together that maximized their unique abilities. Joshua would use his extraordinary hearing and smell to identify suspicious water sources or food supplies, picking up on subtle cues that others missed. Nathaniel would test anything suspicious, consuming small amounts to determine if they were contaminated and with what. Rebecca would examine food preparation areas and storage, looking for signs of tampering or spoilage. Clara would provide medical care to anyone who had already been poisoned or who was sick, and Sarah coordinated everything, kept records, managed their travel, and maintained the network of contacts that supported their work. They were remarkably effective. They prevented outbreaks before they could begin. They identified poisoning attempts and warned communities. They saved countless lives over the years of their work together, but they were also drawing attention, and not all of it was positive. White supremacists saw them as a threat. They were interfering with one of the tactics used to terrorize black communities, making it harder to poison people without consequence. Some whites saw their abilities as evidence of racial difference, as proof that black people were not fully human, but something other antral. Scientists wanted to study them to understand how their bodies worked. Religious leaders called them unnatural, demonic agents of evil, and entrepreneurs saw them as a potential source of profit, imagining exhibitions and shows where their abilities could be demonstrated for paying audiences. The group learned to move quickly, to never stay in one place too long. They developed a network of supporters, people who would hide them, feed them, warn them of danger, help them move from place to place. They became part of the underground resistance, the network of black people who were fighting back against oppression in whatever ways they could. Dr. Turnsley. Reed back in Georgia heard rumors about Nathaniel and what he was doing. He was fascinated but also deeply frustrated. He had lost his research subject, his chance to understand the biological mechanisms behind Nathaniel's immunity. He wrote letters to colleagues describing what he had observed during his time studying Nathaniel, asking if anyone had encountered similar cases or had explanations to offer. Most of his colleagues dismissed his accounts as exaggerated or fabricated. They couldn't believe that a Negro child could possess such remarkable immunity. They suggested that Dr. Reed had been deceived or had made errors in his observations. A few expressed interest, but they had no explanations to offer, no theoretical framework that could account for what Dr. Reed described. One colleague, however, took Dr. Reed seriously. Dr. Reed seriously. Samuel Thornton was a physician and researcher in Boston who had been studying unusual cases of disease resistance. He had encountered several individuals who seemed to have extraordinary immune responses, though nothing quite as dramatic as what Dr. Reed described in Nathaniel's case. Dr. Hood. Thornton proposed a radical theory for the time. He suggested that perhaps these individuals had what he called inborn variations in their biological constitution, differences in how their bodies processed foreign substances. He theorized that just as people varied in height, in strength, in intelligence, they might also vary in their ability to resist poisons and diseases. Some people, he suggested, might be born with more efficient detoxification systems, with livers and kidneys that process toxins more effectively, with immune systems that responded more robustly to threats. It was a revolutionary idea for 1890s medicine, decades before the discovery of DNA and the understanding of genetics. But it was closer to the truth than any other explanation that had been offered. Dr. Thornton even suggested that such variations might run in families, that they might be inherited, which implied a biological mechanism, even if he couldn't explain what that mechanism was. Dr. Reed became somewhat obsessed with finding Nathaniel again. He wanted to test Dr. Thornton's theories, to conduct more rigorous experiments with modern equipment, to potentially isolate whatever was different in Nathaniel's biology. He hired investigators to track down reports of the poison testing boy and his companions. He offered rewards for information leading to their location. He wrote to sheriffs and law enforcement officials in counties across the South, asking them to report any sightings, but Nathaniel and his group had become skilled at avoiding detection. They used false names when necessary, changed their appearance, never stayed anywhere long enough to be traced. They had learned from bitter experience that being found by white authorities rarely ended well for black people, especially black people who were seen as unusual or valuable in some way. The years between 1892 and 1897 were both the most productive and the most dangerous of Nathaniel's life. He and his companions saved hundreds of lives, perhaps thousands if you counted the people who avoided poisoning because of their warnings and interventions. They identified contaminated wells before entire communities could be poisoned. They detected arsenic in food supplies meant for sharecroppers. They warned people about toxic plants that had been deliberately placed near water sources or grazing areas. They became legends in black communities across the South, symbols of resistance and resilience and mutual aid. But the cost was high. They were constantly hunted, constantly in danger. They lost supporters to violence, to intimidation, to the relentless pressure of living under white supremacist terror. Clara contracted typhoid in 1896 while tending to patients, and her immunity to smallpox offered no protection. She nearly died, saved only by the devoted care of her companions and her own resilient constitution. Joshua was beaten severely by vigilantes who caught him testing a well they had poisoned, left for dead on the side of a road. He survived but lost hearing in one ear, diminishing the extraordinary sense that had been so valuable to their work. Rebecca barely escaped a lynch mob in Alabama after she identified contaminated food at a church gathering. Some of the white people who had supplied the food took her identification as an accusation of deliberate poisoning, which it was, and they tried to kill her for daring to suggest that white people would harm black people. She escaped only because Joshua and Nathaniel arrived with others from the community and managed to get her away before the mob could organize itself, and Nathaniel himself was wearing down. He was only 19 years old by 1897, but he felt anxious, burdened by everything he had seen and done, by all the death and suffering he had witnessed, by the constant responsibility of trying to protect people in a world determined to destroy them. His body might have been immune to poison, but his spirit was not immune to exhaustion, to grief, to the cumulative weight of trauma. His mother, Sarah, could see it happening. She watched her son carrying more and more weight, becoming quieter, more withdrawn, less likely to smile or laugh. He still did the work, still tested water and food, still warned people and saved lives. But the joy had gone out of it. It had become a burden, an obligation, something he did because he had to rather than because he wanted to. She tried to talk to him about it, tried to suggest that maybe they should rest, should find a safe place to settle for a while, should let others carry the burden. But Nathaniel couldn't stop. He felt responsible for everyone, felt that if he rested and someone died from poison that he could have detected, it would be his fault. It was an impossible burden for anyone to carry, especially for a 19-year-old who had already lived through more trauma and exploitation than most people experienced in a lifetime. The last confirmed sighting of Nathaniel Johnson was in April of 1897 in a small town in northern Alabama. He was helping a community deal with a contaminated well, the same work he had been doing for 5 years. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him, described his appearance, documented his testing of the water. He confirmed that the well had been poisoned with mercury, helped the community find an alternative water source, warned them about how to safely dispose of the contaminated water. Then he disappeared. Some accounts say he left with his companions heading north. Others claim he left alone, saying he needed time to himself. Still others suggest he never left at all, that something happened to him in that Alabama town, something that was never reported or documented. What happened to Nathaniel Johnson after April 1897 remains one of the great mysteries of his story. There are theories, rumors, and occasional unconfirmed sightings, but no definitive answer. Some say he traveled north to Chicago or Detroit, that he settled in one of the growing black communities in northern cities, that he lived out his life quietly under an assumed name, perhaps still helping people, but without drawing attention to himself. Others claim he was murdered, killed by white supremacists who had been hunting him for years, who saw him as a threat and an abomination. They suggest his body was hidden or destroyed so that no one could study it even in death, so that his unusual biology would remain forever mysterious. There were whispered stories of night riders finally catching up with him, of violence in the dark, of a body that was never found. Still others insist he continued his work just more secretly, becoming like a ghost appearing when and where he was needed and then vanishing again. In this version of the story, he became almost mythical, a figure who showed up when communities were in danger, who tested their water and warned them of poison, who saved lives and then disappeared before anyone could thank him or ask too many questions. His mother Sarah never saw him again after the spring of 1897. She waited in Tennessee, living with her sister Martha, hoping every day that Nathaniel would return or at least send word that he was alive. But there was nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. She never stopped looking, never stopped asking travelers if they had seen a young man matching his description. But the trail had gone completely cold. In her final years before her death in 1902, Sarah would tell anyone who would listen about her remarkable son. She told them about the contaminated water he survived as a child, about the rattlesnake bite that should have killed him, about the cruel experiments he endured at the hands of men who saw him as an object rather than a person. She told them how he had turned his suffering into service, how he had used the gift that made him a target for exploitation to instead protect people, to save lives, to fight back against those who used poison as a weapon of terror. Most people dismissed her stories as the fantasies of a grieving mother, as exaggerations or fabrications designed to cope with loss. But every word was true. Sarah had kept her journal, had documented their travels and the lives they had saved. She showed it to people, but few believed it. It was too fantastic, too impossible. A boy who couldn't be poisoned, who could drink arsenic and live, who could taste mercury and suffer no harm. It sounded like folklore, like a tall tale, not like something that could actually happen in the real world. But the communities that Nathaniel and his companions had helped knew better. They kept their own records documented in church registers, in family Bibles and oral histories passed down through generations. They told stories of the young men who had warned them about poison wells, who had identified contaminated food, who had saved their children and grandparents from death by poison. These weren't fantasies. These were testimonies from people whose lives had been saved, who had seen Nathaniel's work firsthand. The medical establishment, when confronted with accounts of Nathaniel Johnson and his companions, remained largely skeptical and dismissive. Dr. Reed's careful documentation was discounted as unreliable, the work of a country doctor with limited training and poor experimental controls. The testimonies from black communities were ignored entirely, dismissed as superstition and folklore rather than genuine witness accounts. The entire phenomenon was relegated to the category of Negro folk belief, not worthy of serious scientific consideration. This dismissal was rooted in the scientific racism of the era. The medical establishment was deeply invested in proving black inferiority, and individuals like Nathaniel, who demonstrated extraordinary abilities, threatened that narrative. It was easier and more ideologically convenient to dismiss the accounts as false than to grapple with what they might mean. With the possibility that the racist theories about black biology were wrong, that black people were capable of remarkable things that white science couldn't explain. But even as official medicine dismissed Nathaniel's story, it persisted in the communities that remembered him. Parents told their children about the poison tester, about the boy who couldn't be hurt by the things that killed others. Those children told their children, preserving the memory across generations. In the oral tradition of African American communities, Nathaniel Johnson became a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest times, even under the most brutal oppression, people found ways to resist, to survive, to help each other, to matter. The 20th century brought enormous advances in medical science. The discovery of genetics, the understanding of DNA, the ability to analyze biological processes at the molecular level. All of these developments gave scientists tools that Dr. Reed and his contemporaries could never have imagined. Modern medicine can now explain many things that were once mysterious, can understand resistance to disease and toxins in ways that would have seemed like magic a century ago. And yet, when modern researchers encounter the documented accounts of Nathaniel Johnson, they are still puzzled. The broad-spectrum immunity he apparently possessed, if the historical accounts are accurate, remains difficult to explain, even with our current understanding of human biology. Resistance to one specific toxin can be explained through genetic variations affecting enzyme production or cellular mechanisms, but resistance to bacterial contamination, snake venom, arsenic, mercury, lead, and numerous plant-based toxins all at once. That suggests something far more complex, something that doesn't fit neatly into our current models of how the human body processes poisons. Some modern researchers have proposed that Nathaniel might have had multiple genetic variations working together, a unique combination of mutations affecting his liver enzymes, kidney function, cellular permeability, and immune response. The probability of such a combination occurring naturally would be extraordinarily low, but not impossible. Other researchers suggest that the accounts may have been exaggerated over time, that perhaps Nathaniel had resistance to some specific toxins and the stories grew to encompass more. But there's also the possibility, the one that most challenges our current understanding, that Nathaniel Johnson represented something we still don't fully comprehend about human biology, about the potential capabilities that might exist within our genetic code, about mechanisms of protection and resilience that we haven't yet discovered. The history of medicine is full of observations that were dismissed as impossible until we developed the tools and frameworks to understand them. Perhaps Nathaniel Johnson is still waiting for us to catch up, for our science to advance to the point where we can finally explain what made him so extraordinary. What we can say with certainty based on the historical record is that Nathaniel Johnson lived, that he possessed unusual resistance to toxins, that he was exploited because of this difference, and that he chose to use his unusual abilities to help others. His story, whether it represents biological reality or has been embellished over time, matters because of what it tells us about resilience, about the human capacity to turn suffering into service, about the determination to make a difference even when the world seems determined to crush you. Nathaniel Johnson was born into a system designed to destroy him. He was the child of an enslaved woman born in the aftermath of slavery into a society that had replaced chains with laws but maintained the same brutal oppression. He possessed an unusual gift that made him a target for scientific exploitation, for religious persecution, for commercial exhibition. He had every reason to hide, to run, to try to live as quietly as possible and avoid attention. Instead, he chose to fight. He turned the thing that made him different, the thing that had made him a victim of experimentation and exploitation, into a tool for protecting others. He traveled the South testing water and food, warning communities about poison, saving lives. He risked capture and harm to do work that no one compensated him for, that brought him no material benefit, that only added to his burdens. His legacy lives on, not in medical textbooks or scientific journals, but in the communities he helped, in the descendants of the people he saved, in the stories passed down through generations. He is remembered as a symbol of resistance, as proof that even in the most oppressive circumstances, people can find ways to fight back, to protect each other, to make their lives matter. The question of what was in Nathaniel Johnson's blood may never be answered definitively. Without tissue samples to analyze, without DNA to sequence, without the ability to study him directly, Modern science can only speculate based on historical accounts that may or may not be entirely accurate, but perhaps that's not the most important question. Perhaps what matters more is not the biological mechanism, but the human choice, not the unusual immunity, but what he did with it. Nathaniel Johnson's story reminds us that science and medicine must always be grounded in ethics, in respect for human dignity, in the recognition that every person, no matter how unusual their biology, deserves to be treated as fully human. It reminds us of the dangers of treating people as objects of study rather than as individuals with agency and rights. It reminds us that the most remarkable thing about Nathaniel wasn't his immunity to poison, but his immunity to despair, his refusal to be broken by oppression, his determination to use what made him different to make a difference. More than a century after his disappearance, Nathaniel Johnson remains a mystery and a symbol. The boy who could not be poisoned became the man who protected others from poison. The child who was exploited and dehumanized became an adult who fought back against that dehumanization. The subject of racist pseudoscience became a hero to the communities that white science dismissed and devalued. His story deserves to be told not just because it's medically fascinating, though it is, and not just because it raises questions that science still can't answer, though it does. It deserves to be told because Nathaniel Johnson was a real person who lived through real horror and found a way to respond with courage and compassion. Because he represents countless other black people whose stories were never recorded, whose remarkable abilities and acts of resistance were dismissed or forgotten. Because his life, however brief and however hard, mattered. And because his legacy challenges us still. Challenges us to see people as more than the sum of their biological parts. To recognize that the most important question is never just what makes someone different, but what they choose to do with that difference. Nathaniel Johnson chose to save lives. That choice, far more than any medical explanation, is why his story endures, why it matters, why we still talk about the boy whose blood contained mysteries that science could not and still cannot explain.